They say a man with everything feels nothing, but they've never seen Alexander Hayes bleed. The whispers about him had always been the same, passed quietly between employees who never dared speak too loudly within the glass walls of his $40 million Miami estate. A man so cold that even the ocean breeze seemed to avoid him. A billionaire whose presence alone could silence a room faster than any command. A man who built empires with a single decision and broke people without ever raising his voice. And yet on that scorching afternoon, when the sun burned at nearly 90 degrees and the marble beneath everyone's feet felt too hot to stand still, something shifted, something no one was prepared to witness. Because Alexander Hayes was standing alone by the edge of his infinity pool, his usual perfectly composed posture slightly off, his sleeve darkened, his expression unreadable but different. And the staff noticed. Of course they noticed. They always noticed everything about him. But no one moved. Not a single step forward, not a single question asked. Because you didn't approach Alexander Hayes unless you were ready to lose everything. That was the unspoken rule. The kind that didn't need to be written down to be followed. And yet as seconds stretched longer than they should, as the quiet tension wrapped tighter around the space, there was one person who didn't seem to understand the rule, or maybe she understood it and chose to ignore it, because Sophie Bennett had only been working there for 3 weeks. Just another pool girl hired to clean, to maintain, to stay invisible. And invisibility had always been her survival skill. Growing up with nothing taught her that much. But something about the way he stood there, not commanding, not intimidating, just still, made her hesitate in a different way. Like for a split second the stories didn't match the man in front of her, and before her mind could catch up to her instincts, she stepped forward. One small step that might as well have echoed across the entire property, a step that made 2 nearby staff members exchange alarmed glances, a silent warning passing between them. Don't do it, don't get involved. But Sophie didn't stop. She walked closer, close enough to see that his breathing wasn't as steady as it should be, close enough to notice that he hadn't even acknowledged anyone else around him, like the world had narrowed into something quieter, something heavier. And when she finally reached him, there was a brief moment, just one heartbeat, where everything seemed to pause, where the distance between who he was supposed to be and what she was about to do felt almost impossible to cross. But she crossed it anyway, reaching out without permission, without hesitation, her fingers lightly wrapping around his wrist as she pressed a clean towel against his hand. And that was the exact moment the air changed. Because Alexander Hayes didn't pull away, he didn't react the way everyone expected him to. He didn't shut her down or freeze her in place with a look. Instead, he looked at her, really looked at her, like he was trying to understand something that didn't make sense, like her presence was an interruption he hadn't planned for and didn't know how to control. And for the first time anyone could remember, the most feared man in that mansion wasn't the one holding the power in that moment. Because Sophie Bennett, the girl no one noticed, had just done the one thing no one else dared to do, and neither of them realized it yet. But that single, quiet act had already started something neither of them would be able to stop. No one in that mansion could remember the last time Alexander Hayes allowed anyone to touch him. Not even for something as simple as adjusting his jacket or handing him a document. And yet there he stood, completely still, as Sophie Bennett held his wrist like it was the most natural thing in the world, her fingers steady, her focus entirely on the small but visible injury, as if the man in front of her was not the most powerful person in the city, but just someone who needed help. And that was exactly what unsettled him, not the contact itself, but the absence of fear in her eyes, because everyone else always had it. That hesitation, that invisible wall they never crossed. But Sophie had already crossed it without even realizing it. And for a moment he said nothing, his gaze fixed on her face as if trying to place her in a world where everyone had a role and a distance. Yet she did not seem to belong to either, and Sophie, unaware of the storm of thoughts behind his silence, continued what she started, adjusting the towel slightly, her voice soft but clear as she finally spoke, saying, "You should sit down for a minute. It is too hot to just stand here like this." And the words alone were enough to make 2 nearby staff members stiffen in disbelief. Because no one gave Alexander Hayes instructions, not unless they wanted to lose their job within the hour. But again, he did not react the way anyone expected. Instead, his eyes shifted briefly toward the pool, then back to her, and without a single word, he did something even more shocking. He listened, lowering himself onto the edge of the lounge chair nearby with a controlled but noticeable pause, as if he was not used to being told what to do, but also not entirely opposed to it. And Sophie followed naturally, still focused on making sure the towel stayed in place, her movements careful but not hesitant. And that was when the silence between them became something different, not tense, not fearful, but unfamiliar in a way that made everything around them fade just slightly. Because for the first time in a very long time, Alexander was not surrounded by expectations or pressure or calculated conversations. He was simply there, in a moment that no one had planned, and it showed in the way his expression softened just enough to be noticeable if someone looked closely, which Sophie did not, because she was too focused on finishing what she started. Only when she finally let go did she seem to realize where she was and who she had just been speaking to, her hand pulling back almost instantly as awareness hit her all at once, and the shift in her expression was immediate. A flicker of uncertainty replacing her earlier calm as she took a small step back, her voice quieter now. As she added, "You should probably have someone check that properly." And there it was, the distance returning, the invisible line she had crossed now suddenly clear to her. But it was already too late to undo what had happened, because Alexander Hayes was still looking at her, not with annoyance, not with authority, but with something far more complicated, something that made no sense to him. As if in those few minutes she had disrupted a pattern he had spent years building. And before she could turn away completely, before she could disappear back into the role she was supposed to play, he spoke, his voice low but unmistakably directed at her, asking, "What is your name?" And the question alone was enough to make her pause mid-step, because it was not just a question, it was an acknowledgement, something no one else in her position ever received from him. And when she turned back, just slightly, answering Sophie, her voice barely above a breath, neither of them realized that this was not the end of a brief encounter, but the beginning of something that would slowly unravel everything they thought they understood about themselves and each other the moment her name left her lips. Something about the way Alexander Hayes repeated it silently in his mind made the air feel heavier, like it carried more weight than it should have. And Sophie felt it too, even if she could not explain why. Because men like him did not ask for names unless they intended to remember them. And being remembered by someone like Alexander Hayes was not always a good thing. Yet there was no sharp edge in his tone, no underlying threat, just a quiet curiosity that did not match the story she had heard. And for a second longer than necessary, neither of them moved, until the distant sound of a phone ringing snapped the moment apart, pulling reality back into place, and Alexander's attention shifted just slightly as one of his assistants approached carefully, holding out the device with both hands as if even that required permission, his voice low and cautious as he mentioned an urgent call. And just like that, the version of Alexander Hayes everyone knew returned, his posture straightening, his expression cooling, the softness disappearing behind something controlled and unreadable. But before he stepped fully back into the role that defined him, his gaze returned to Sophie one more time, deliberate, measuring, as if confirming something he had not yet put into words. And then without another question, without another explanation, he simply said, "You should stay close to the house today." And the statement caught her off guard because it was not a request, and not exactly an order either, more like a decision he had already made on her behalf. And before she could respond, before she could even process what it meant, he was already walking away, taking the call as he moved, his voice calm and authoritative once more, leaving Sophie standing there with a strange feeling she could not shake, because nothing about that interaction fit the version of him she had expected. And as she turned back toward her work, trying to convince herself it was nothing, just a brief moment that would disappear like everything else in that mansion, she could not ignore the way the other staff members were now looking at her, not with curiosity, but with a quiet kind of alarm, like she had unknowingly stepped into something far more complicated than she realized. And one of them, a woman who had been there far longer than Sophie, approached her slowly, her voice barely above a whisper as she asked, "What did you do?" And Sophie shook her head, answering honestly that she had only helped. But the woman's expression did not ease. Instead, it tightened as she glanced in the direction Alexander had gone before leaning in closer and saying, "You do not understand. People who get his attention do not stay invisible for long." And that was exactly what Sophie had been trying to be. Invisible, unnoticed, safe. But now that safety felt uncertain, like something had shifted in a way she could not undo. And the rest of the afternoon passed with a tension she could feel in every glance, every quiet conversation that stopped the moment she walked by, until eventually the sun began to lower and the heat softened, casting long reflections across the pool. And just when she thought the day would finally end without anything else happening, she heard footsteps behind her again, slower this time, more deliberate, and before she could turn fully, she already knew who it was, because there was a presence to Alexander Hayes that did not need an introduction, and when she faced him, there was no one else around, no staff, no assistants, just the two of them standing in a silence that felt very different from before. And this time when he spoke, his voice was quieter, almost thoughtful, as if he had spent the past few hours considering something he did not usually have to think about. And what he said next was not what she expected at all, because instead of giving an order or asking a question, he simply said, "You were not afraid." And the statement lingered between them, not accusing, not impressed, just certain. And Sophie hesitated, not because she did not have an answer, but because she was not sure which answer would change everything. And in that moment, she began to realize that whatever had started earlier was not over. It was only just beginning. The question hung in the air longer than it should have. Simple on the surface, yet carrying a weight Sophie could not ignore. And for a moment she considered giving the safest answer, the one that would end the conversation quickly and return everything back to normal. But something in the way Alexander Hayes was looking at her made it clear that he was not asking out of casual curiosity. He was observing, measuring, waiting, and Sophie realized that whatever she said next would matter more than she intended. So instead of pretending, she answered honestly, her voice steady but quiet as she said, "I was just not enough to walk away." And the honesty in her words seemed to catch him off guard in a way that no rehearsed response ever could, because people around him rarely admitted fear. They either hid it or let it control them. But Sophie had done neither, and for the first time that day, something almost unnoticeable shifted in his expression. Not a smile, not even close, but a subtle change that softened the edge he carried. And for a brief second, it made him look less like the untouchable figure everyone feared and more like a man trying to understand something unfamiliar. And he did not respond right away, his silence stretching just enough to make the moment feel fragile, until he finally spoke. Again, his tone lower, more thoughtful as he said, "Most people would have walked away," and Sophie shrugged slightly. The movement small but genuine as she replied, "Maybe most people are used to being afraid of you." And the words could have been risky, even disrespectful coming from anyone else. But from her they landed differently, not as a challenge, but as a quiet observation, and instead of reacting with irritation, Alexander held her gaze, as if considering whether she had just crossed another invisible line or simply stepped into a truth no one else dared to say out loud. And after a pause, he let out a slow breath, not frustrated, not dismissive, just real. And that alone made Sophie realize how unusual this entire interaction had become, because nothing about this felt like a conversation between a billionaire and an employee. It felt like something else entirely, something undefined. And before she could analyze it further, he shifted slightly, glancing toward the horizon where the sky had begun to fade into softer colors, the heat of the day giving way to a quieter evening. And when he looked back at her, there was a new clarity in his voice as he said, "You see things differently." And it was not a question, it was a statement. One that made Sophie hesitate because she was not sure if that was a good thing or something that would complicate her life in ways she was not prepared for. And she almost responded, almost tried to explain herself. But before she could, he continued, his tone returning to something more composed, more controlled, as if he had decided to close whatever door had briefly opened between them. And yet his next words contradicted that entirely, because instead of ending the conversation, he said, "I want you here tomorrow. Same time." And this time it was unmistakably a decision, not open for negotiation, and Sophie blinked, caught between confusion and disbelief, because nothing in her job required direct interaction with him. And yet, here he was, creating a reason where none existed, and she knew enough to understand that refusing was not really an option, but accepting felt like stepping further into something she did not fully understand. And still, she nodded, because part of her knew that saying no would not change anything. It would only delay what had already started, and Alexander seemed to register her response with a small, almost imperceptible nod of his own before turning away, his presence shifting once again into the distant, untouchable version of himself as he walked back toward the house, leaving Sophie standing there with a quiet realization settling in, because whatever this was, whatever connection had sparked between them, it was no longer accidental, and that made it far more dangerous than she had expected that night. Sophie Bennett barely slept, not because of fear alone, but because of the quiet, persistent thought that something in her life had just shifted in a way she could not control, and no matter how many times she told herself it was just a strange interaction with a powerful man who would forget her by morning, the memory of the way Alexander Hayes had looked at her refused to fade, not cold, not distant, but focused in a way that made her feel seen in a place where people like her were meant to disappear. And by the time the sun rose again over the Miami coastline, casting soft gold light across the estate, Sophie already knew the day would not be normal, because nothing about yesterday had been normal, and still she showed up, earlier than usual, telling herself it was better to face whatever was coming than to spend another night wondering. And as she moved through her routine, checking the water levels, arranging the chairs, making sure everything looked exactly as it should, she could feel it again, that subtle tension in the air, the quiet awareness from the other staff who had not forgotten what they witnessed, their glances more frequent, their conversations more guarded, and no one said it out loud, but the message was clear. Something had changed, and Sophie was now part of it. And for a moment she considered keeping her distance, staying out of sight, avoiding the situation entirely. But that option disappeared the second she heard footsteps behind her, steady, familiar, unmistakable, and even before she turned, she knew he was there, because Alexander Hayes did not arrive quietly. His presence alone carried a weight that filled the space around him. And when she finally faced him, there was no hesitation this time, no confusion about why he was there, because he had made it clear the night before. And yet what surprised her was not his presence but the absence of anyone else, no assistants, no staff hovering nearby, just him standing a few feet away, dressed as impeccably as always but somehow less distant than before, and for a brief moment neither of them spoke, the silence stretching just enough to feel intentional rather than awkward, until he broke it, his voice calm, measured, but carrying something new beneath the surface as he said, "You came," and it was such a simple statement, yet it felt like more than that, like he had expected her not to, like he had been testing something without saying it out loud, and Sophie nodded slightly. Her response just as simple as she answered, "You asked me to," and for a second his gaze sharpened, not in irritation but in interest, as if he recognized the difference between obligation and choice, and that difference mattered more than he let on. And instead of responding immediately, he stepped closer, not invading her space but closing the distance just enough to shift the dynamic between them, and Sophie felt it instantly, the subtle change that made everything feel more focused, more personal. And when he finally spoke again, his tone was quieter, more deliberate as he said, "I do not ask things I do not intend to follow through on," and the implication behind those words was impossible to ignore, because this was no longer about a single moment or a passing curiosity. This was something he had decided to continue, and Sophie realized that whatever line she had crossed yesterday was not behind her anymore. It was right in front of her, and before she could question it, before she could decide how to respond, he did something unexpected again, something that made her pause in a completely different way, because instead of giving an order or asking a question, he reached out slightly, not touching her, but gesturing toward the pool as he said, "Walk with me," and the request, if it could even be called that, carried a tone she had not heard from him before, not commanding, not distant, but almost human, and for reasons she could not fully explain, Sophie found herself stepping forward without hesitation, falling into step beside him as they moved along the edge of the water, the sound of their footsteps quiet against the stone, and as they walked, she became aware of something that made her pulse quicken just slightly, because this was not how interactions with someone like Alexander Hayes were supposed to happen, not without an audience, not without purpose. And yet here they were, side by side, in a moment that felt far more personal than it should have been, and deep down, Sophie knew that whatever this was, It was only going to get more complicated from here. They walked in silence at first, the kind that did not feel empty but charged with something unspoken. And Sophie became aware of every small detail, the soft sound of water moving against the edge of the infinity pool, the distant hum of the city beyond the gates, the steady rhythm of Alexander Hayes walking beside her, as if this moment had been planned long before she ever arrived in his world. And what unsettled her most was not his presence, but how natural it began to feel, like she was slowly stepping into a space she was never meant to occupy. And after a few steps he spoke again, his voice calm, but carrying a quiet precision as he said, "You do not ask questions." And Sophie glanced at him briefly, unsure if it was an observation or a test, before answering honestly, "I do. I just do not always say them out loud." And that response seemed to hold his attention in a different way, his gaze shifting slightly toward her, not intrusive but intentional, as if he was learning her in pieces rather than all at once. And for a moment he said nothing, then finally asked, "What would you ask me now?" And the question caught her off guard because it was not something she expected from him, not an invitation like that, not a door opened without conditions. And Sophie hesitated, knowing that whatever she chose to say could either bring her closer to him or remind him exactly where she stood. And part of her knew she should keep it safe. Ask something simple, something distant. But another part of her, the same part that stepped forward yesterday without thinking, pushed her to be honest again. And before she could second-guess it, she said, "Why me?" And the words settled between them instantly, heavier than anything else she had said so far. And Alexander stopped walking, not abruptly but enough to shift the moment, his attention fully on her now. And for a brief second, Sophie wondered if she had gone too far, if this was the moment everything would snap back into place, and she would be reminded of the distance between them. But instead he studied her, his expression unreadable yet focused, like he was deciding how much truth to give. And when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before, almost reflective as he said, "Because you did not hesitate." And Sophie felt the answer before she understood it, because it was not just about that moment by the pool. It was about something deeper, something he had not found in anyone else around him. And she let out a small breath, not quite relief, not quite tension, as she replied, "That does not seem like enough." And for the first time there was the faintest shift in his expression that almost resembled something softer, something close to understanding, as he said, "It is more than you think." And the way he said it made it clear that this was not just about her anymore. It was about him too, about something missing that she had unknowingly stepped into. And they resumed walking, slower this time, more aware of each other than before. And Sophie found herself noticing the details she had ignored at first, the controlled way he carried himself, the way his presence always felt deliberate, but also the subtle moments where that control seemed to loosen just slightly when he spoke to her. And it made her wonder how much of him the world had never seen. And as if sensing the direction of her thoughts, he spoke again, his tone more distant now, but not closed off, as he said, "People assume things about me." And Sophie nodded lightly, answering, "They do that with everyone, but not everyone lets it define them." And the words seemed to land differently than expected, because instead of dismissing them, he looked ahead, his gaze fixed on the horizon, as if considering something he had not allowed himself to think about before. And for a moment neither of them spoke again. But the silence no longer felt uncertain. It felt like something building, something shifting quietly beneath the surface. And Sophie realized that this was no longer just an unusual interaction or a passing curiosity. It was something that was beginning to take shape, something neither of them fully understood yet, but both of them were already too involved to ignore. And as they reached the far end of the pool, Alexander slowed slightly before stopping again, turning just enough to face her as he said, "This does not leave this place." And the words were not harsh, not threatening, but firm in a way that made the boundary clear. And Sophie met his gaze, understanding more than he had said out loud, before nodding once, because whatever this was, it existed in a space separate from everything else. And deep down, she knew that was exactly what made it impossible to walk away from the boundary he said should have made things clearer, simpler even. But instead it made everything feel more complicated, because Sophie realized that whatever existed between them was not meant to survive outside those quiet moments by the pool. And that thought stayed with her long after their walk ended, lingering in the way she moved through the rest of her shift, more aware of every glance, every whisper that seemed to follow her now. And even though no one said anything directly, the atmosphere had shifted in a way that was impossible to ignore, as if the invisible line between her and the rest of the staff had grown sharper overnight. And by the time the afternoon sun reached its peak again, the heat rising to nearly 90 degrees, Sophie found herself replaying every word Alexander had said, trying to understand what he wanted, what he expected, and more importantly, why he had chosen her. And just as she was beginning to convince herself that maybe it was nothing more than a temporary distraction for him, something that would fade as quickly as it started, reality reminded her otherwise, because later that day, as she was adjusting the chairs near the far end of the pool, she overheard something she was never meant to hear, two senior staff members speaking in low voices, their conversation careful but not careful enough, and she froze without meaning to, her hands still as the words reached her, mentioning her name alongside his, questioning how long it would last, wondering if she even understood what kind of attention she had drawn, and one of them said something that stayed with her longer than anything else, saying people who get close to him do not stay the same. And the tone behind it was not admiration, it was warning, and Sophie felt that warning settle deep inside her, because up until that moment, everything had felt uncertain but not dangerous, unfamiliar but not threatening, and now there was a new layer to it, something she could not ignore, and for the first time she questioned whether she should step back, whether she should find a way to return to being invisible before it was too late. But even as the thought formed, she already knew the answer, because something about the way Alexander looked at her, the way he spoke to her, had already changed how she saw everything, and walking away would not undo that. It would only leave questions she could never answer. And that realization stayed with her as the day slowly came to an end, the sky shifting into soft shades of orange and pink, the air cooling just enough to make the space feel quieter, almost calmer, and yet beneath that calm was something building, something neither of them had addressed directly, and Sophie felt it the moment she sensed him again, his presence unmistakable even without turning around, and when she did face him, there was something different in his expression this time. Not distant, not controlled in the same way as before, but focused in a way that made it clear he had been thinking about this just as much as she had. And for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence stretching just enough to feel intentional, until he finally broke it, his voice steady but carrying a weight she had not heard before as he said, "You heard them." And Sophie did not need to ask who he meant, because it was obvious, and instead of denying it, she nodded once, her honesty returning without hesitation as she said it is hard not to, and for a brief second something shifted in his gaze, not irritation, not concern, but something closer to acknowledgement, like he had expected this moment to come and was simply waiting to see how she would respond, and instead of dismissing it, instead of telling her to ignore it like most people in his position would, he took a step closer, not enough to close the distance completely, but enough to make his next words feel more personal, more deliberate as he said, "They are not wrong." And that was not what Sophie expected to hear, because it was not reassurance, it was not denial, it was truth, and the honesty of it caught her off guard in a way that made her pause, because now the choice in front of her was clearer than ever, not hidden behind uncertainty or misunderstanding, but laid out plainly, and as she stood there, meeting his gaze, she realized that whatever came next would not be accidental anymore. It would be a decision, one that neither of them could pretend they did not understand. And for the first time since all of this began, Sophie felt the weight of that decision settle fully in her chest. Because stepping forward now meant stepping into something that would change everything. The truth in his words did not feel heavy because it was harsh. It felt heavy because it left no room for illusion. And Sophie stood there for a moment longer than she should have, realizing that whatever she had hoped this was, something simple, something temporary, something that could quietly fade away, was no longer possible, because Alexander Hayes was not the kind of man who allowed things to exist without purpose. And if he had continued this, if he had chosen to stand here and say that they were not wrong, then it meant he understood exactly what this could become, and still did not step back. And that was what unsettled her most, not the attention, not the whispers, but the fact that he was aware of the consequences and remained anyway. And for the first time since this began, Sophie felt something shift inside her, a quiet instinct telling her that this was the moment where she needed to decide whether she would protect herself or step further into something that could change her life in ways she could not predict. And her voice, when she finally spoke, was calm but carried a steadiness that had not been there before, as she said then, "Maybe they are right about something else too." And his gaze sharpened slightly, not defensive, but attentive, as if he already knew she was about to challenge the space between them. And she continued, not backing away this time, saying, "Maybe I should not be here." And the words settled between them instantly, not as a rejection but as a line drawn, and for a brief second the air seemed to still, as if everything around them was waiting for his response. And Alexander did not answer immediately, his silence longer this time, more deliberate, as if he was considering something beyond the moment itself, something deeper than what either of them had said out loud. And when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before, but carried a clarity that made every word feel intentional as he said, "You could leave." And the simplicity of it caught her off guard, because it was not a command, not even a suggestion. It was the truth, plain and direct. And for a moment Sophie felt something tighten in her chest, because part of her had expected him to stop her, to dismiss her concern, to pull her back into whatever this was without giving her a choice. But he did not. He gave her the option to walk away. And somehow that made the decision harder, not easier, because now it was entirely hers, and she realized that leaving would not just mean stepping away from him. It would mean stepping away from something she had not even fully understood yet, something that had already begun to change the way she saw him, and maybe even the way she saw herself. And the thought of that lingered just long enough to make her hesitate. And he noticed, of course he noticed, the way her silence shifted, the way her certainty wavered for just a second. And when he spoke again, there was something different in his tone, not softer, not persuasive, but more honest than anything he had said so far, as he added, "But you are still here." And that was the moment everything became undeniable, because he was not asking her to stay, he was pointing out that she already had. And Sophie felt the weight of that truth settle in, because he was right. Despite everything, despite the warnings, despite the risks, she had not walked away. And that meant something whether she wanted it to or not. And for a brief moment neither of them moved. The distance between them unchanged, but the meaning behind it entirely different now. Until Sophie finally exhaled softly, her voice quieter, but no longer uncertain, as she said, "I do not know what this is." And his response came almost immediately, calm and steady as he said, "Neither do I." And for the first time since this began, there was something real in that answer, something unguarded. Because a man like Alexander Hayes was not supposed to admit uncertainty. And yet he did. And that alone changed everything. Because now this was no longer just curiosity or control. It was something undefined, something neither of them could fully explain. And as the last light of the day faded behind them, Sophie realized that whatever this was, it was no longer something she could simply walk away from without leaving a part of herself behind. And deep down, she was no longer sure she wanted to. The silence that followed his words did not feel uncertain anymore. It felt inevitable. Like both of them had stepped into something neither could fully explain, but neither was willing to deny. And Sophie stood there, feeling the weight of everything that had unfolded in such a short time. From a simple moment by the pool to something that now felt far more complicated, far more real. And for the first time she understood that this was not just about him choosing her or her choosing to stay. It was about what happened next, because moments like this did not stay still. They moved forward whether you were ready or not. And as she looked at Alexander Hayes, she saw it clearly, not the billionaire everyone feared, not the distant figure surrounded by power and control, but a man standing in front of her without the usual barriers, without the certainty he carried everywhere else. And that realization shifted something inside her in a way she could not ignore, because it made everything feel more personal, more dangerous in a different way. And yet instead of stepping back, instead of creating distance, she found herself holding his gaze just a second longer, long enough to acknowledge what they had both already understood. And that was when he moved. Not abruptly, not with force, but with intention, closing the space between them just enough to make the moment feel undeniably real. His voice quieter now, almost reflective as he said, "This changes things." And Sophie felt the truth in those words immediately, because nothing about this could remain hidden forever. Not the attention, not the connection, not the way everything around them was already starting to shift. And for a brief moment she considered what that meant, what it would cost, what it could become, and instead of answering right away, she asked the only question that mattered now, her voice steady despite everything as she said, "For who?" And his response came without hesitation, his gaze unwavering as he said, "For both of us." And there was no warning in his tone, no attempt to soften the reality of it, just honesty, clear and direct, and somehow that made it easier to accept, not because it removed the risk, but because it made the choice feel real, and Sophie let out a quiet breath, not of fear, not of relief, but of understanding, because this was no longer about whether she should stay or leave. It was about whether she was willing to face what staying would bring, and deep down, she already knew the answer, because she had not walked away when she had the chance, she had not pulled back when it would have been easier, and that meant something, whether she wanted it to or not. And as the last light of the evening disappeared and the first hints of night settled around them, she nodded once, a small movement, but one that carried more meaning than anything she had said so far, and Alexander seemed to recognize it instantly, not with a visible reaction, not with words, but with a subtle shift in the way he looked at her, like something had just been confirmed, something he had already been expecting, and for a moment neither of them spoke again, because there was nothing left to explain, nothing left to question, only what came next. And as he finally stepped back slightly, creating just enough distance to return to the world they both knew, he said, "Tomorrow will not be the same." And Sophie felt the truth of that settle in before he even finished speaking, because whatever this had started, it was no longer something that could stay hidden by the pool or contained within quiet conversations. It was already moving beyond that, already becoming something that would reach into every part of their lives whether they were ready for it or not. And as she watched him walk away, his presence shifting once again into the composed, untouchable figure everyone else saw, Sophie realized that the man she had just stood with and the man the world feared were not two different people. They were the same, and she had just stepped into the space between them. And once you saw that side of someone like Alexander Hayes, there was no going back, only forward into whatever came next.